They never heard the engines. That was the shock. Allied observers in southern Italy reported aircraft overhead, yet the familiar growl that usually gave them precious seconds of warning was missing. Bombs struck positions that should have had time to scatter. Anti-aircraft guns swung too late. The reports all used the same phrase. The planes seemed to glide in, almost silently. This was the moment when enemy forces first encountered the Italian squadron that turned their planes into silent gliders. In a war where sound meant survival, engine noise was as revealing as a flare in the night. Ground crews were trained to listen long before they looked up. Pilots were detected, tracked, and engaged largely because their engines announced their arrival across miles of open terrain. Yet suddenly, Italian aircraft were appearing with little warning, descending out of the evening sky as if carried by the air itself rather than powered by it. The effect was not just tactical, but psychological. Crews hesitated. Spotters doubted their own ears. Reports conflicted. Some believed the aircraft must have been flying higher than expected. Others suspected new technology. None of them guessed the truth. There was no new engine, no secret coating, no experimental design. The planes were ordinary, even outdated by the standards of the time. What made them dangerous was not what was added, but what was deliberately taken away at exactly the right moment. Italian pilots had found a way to remove the single thing their enemies depended on most: sound. And once that realization spread within the squadron, it quietly changed how they approached the battlefield. Keep watching to discover how a simple adjustment turned vulnerable aircraft into near-silent weapons. To understand why this tactic mattered, it helps to look at the position the Italian Air Force found itself in as the war intensified across the Mediterranean. Italian pilots were not flying cutting-edge machines. Many squadrons relied on light bombers and reconnaissance aircraft that were already showing their age, with modest engines, limited speed, and little protection against modern fighters. Against increasingly well-equipped Allied forces, they were often outmatched before a mission even began. The environment made their weakness worse. Southern Europe and North Africa offered clear skies, open terrain, and long sightlines. Sound traveled easily. Anti-aircraft units were trained to react to engine noise long before aircraft became visible. In many cases, the first warning of an incoming strike was not a radar screen or a lookout's shout, but the distant hum of engines growing steadily louder. That sound gave gunners time to prepare, to track, and to fire. Italian pilots knew this well. Traditional attack runs were dangerous, predictable, and costly. Flying low made aircraft easier to hear. Flying high made them easier to spot. Speed was not enough to compensate, and armor was scarce. Fuel shortages further restricted options, forcing crews to calculate every minute in the air. In this setting, surprise was more valuable than firepower. Any method that delayed detection, even briefly, could mean the difference between completing a mission and being shot down. Italian crews did not have the luxury of waiting for new aircraft or revolutionary technology. They had to work with what they already had and find ways to use it differently. That pressure created an unusual mindset. Pilots became more willing to question standard procedures and experiment at the edges of safety. What began as careful fuel management and cautious descent planning soon opened the door to a far more radical idea, one that challenged how powered aircraft were supposed to be flown into combat. And it was during those routine flights, far from enemy fire, that the first clues began to appear. The discovery did not come from a laboratory or a design bureau. It came from repetition, from pilots flying the same routes again and again, watching fuel gauges fall faster than expected, and learning how their aircraft behaved when power was reduced earlier than regulations advised. During long descents back to base, some pilots noticed something unexpected. With the throttle pulled back and the propeller turning freely, the aircraft did not immediately lose control or sink sharply. Instead, it settled into a smooth, stable glide. At first, this was treated cautiously. Cutting power in flight went against instinct and training. Engines were lifelines. Yet the more experienced pilots began to test the limits, always at altitude, always with escape room. They learned that if speed was managed carefully and the descent angle kept shallow, the aircraft could remain controllable for minutes at a time without engine power. More importantly, it became almost silent. A technically minded ground engineer helped explain why. With the engine fully cut, propeller noise vanished. Airflow over the wings remained clean, and without combustion vibrations, sound dropped dramatically. From the ground, the aircraft blended into ambient wind noise until it was nearly overhead. What had once been a liability became an advantage. Training flights turned into deliberate experiments. Pilots practiced restarting engines after long glides. They learned the narrow margins where silence and control overlapped. Mistakes were made, and some attempts ended with tense, rushed recoveries. But the principle held. This was no accident. It was a repeatable technique. And once that became clear, the question was no longer whether it could be done, but whether it could be trusted in combat. The answer would come only one way: by trying it where failure had consequences. Watch to find out how the silent glide moved from experiment to battlefield tactic. When the tactic moved from training to operations, it was applied carefully and selectively. Italian mission planners did not redesign entire sorties around silent flight. Instead, they treated it as a narrow tool, useful only in the final phase of an approach. Aircraft would climb to altitude as usual, engines running normally to conserve control and formation discipline. Only when the target area was reached, often miles away and usually with altitude to spare, did pilots begin the most delicate part of the mission. At a pre-agreed point, engines were throttled back and then fully cut. The change was immediate. Vibration vanished. The familiar noise dropped away. Aircraft slipped into long, shallow descents, trading height for distance. Pilots relied on instruments, landmarks, and instinct rather than power. Communication was kept minimal. Any mistake would be final. From the ground, the effect was unsettling. Anti-aircraft crews, accustomed to hearing engines first, now had nothing to react to. By the time aircraft were spotted visually, they were already in position. Bombs were released with little warning. Reconnaissance passes were completed before defenders fully understood what they were seeing. The tactic demanded discipline. Engines had to be restarted at precise moments, sometimes under fire. A failed restart meant forced landing or worse. There was no margin for panic. Not every pilot could do it, and not every mission justified the risk. But when conditions were right, particularly during dusk or early evening, the silent glide worked. It did not make Italian aircraft invisible or invulnerable. Fighters could still intercept, and visual spotting still mattered. But for a brief window, sound, the enemy's earliest warning system, was taken out of the equation. That alone was enough to change outcomes on certain missions. What mattered most was not how often the trick was used, but how effectively it disrupted expectations. And for a time, that disruption carried real consequences. The impact of the silent glider tactic was never dramatic enough to change the course of the war, but it was real, measurable, and noticed. Allied ground reports began to shift in tone. Mentions of late detection and unexpected approach appeared more frequently, especially in areas where Italian light bombers and reconnaissance aircraft were active. Anti-aircraft crews adjusted by relying more heavily on visual scanning, while commanders pushed for tighter coordination between spotters and gun crews. The battlefield learned, as it always did. For the Italian squadrons involved, the technique brought short-term advantages and long-term limits. Pilots gained confidence knowing they could approach targets without immediately revealing themselves. Some missions succeeded largely because defenders had only seconds to react instead of minutes. Yet, the method demanded ideal conditions. Weather had to be stable. Altitude had to be sufficient. Engines had to restart flawlessly. As Allied radar coverage improved and defensive procedures adapted, the window of effectiveness narrowed. There were also practical constraints. Fuel shortages, mechanical wear, and rising pilot losses reduced opportunities to train new crews in such a delicate technique. What worked for a small number of experienced pilots could not easily be scaled across an air force under constant pressure. Gradually, the silent glide approach became less common, not because it was disproven, but because the environment that allowed it to succeed no longer existed. Still, for a brief period, Italian pilots had forced their enemies to rethink one of the most basic assumptions of air defense. That alone secured the tactic a quiet place in wartime history. If you want to uncover more overlooked battlefield innovations like this one, take a moment to like and subscribe. Discover what comes next, and why some of these secrets were never written down. The silent glider tactic never received a formal name, never appeared in training manuals, and was rarely discussed outside the squadrons that used it. That is partly why it faded so quietly from memory. It did not involve a new aircraft, a breakthrough weapon, or a decisive victory. It was a method born from limitation, shaped by necessity, and sustained only as long as conditions allowed. What makes it significant is not how powerful it was, but how precisely it exploited human expectation. Air defense relied on sound because sound had always been there. Engines meant warning. Removing that single cue disrupted an entire chain of reactions, if only briefly. The tactic worked because pilots understood both the physics of flight and the habits of those trying to stop them. As the war evolved, technology closed the gap. Radar coverage expanded, coordination improved, the margin for such improvisation narrowed. What had once been clever became increasingly dangerous and eventually unnecessary. The tactic was set aside, remembered by those who flew it but rarely recorded in official histories. Yet it fits perfectly within a broader pattern seen again and again in wartime. When resources are limited, ingenuity fills the gap. Small insights, applied at the right moment, can reshape outcomes without ever becoming famous. The Italian squadron did not turn the tide of the war, but they proved something enduring. Sometimes, the most effective weapon is not speed, armor, or firepower. Sometimes, it is the decision to go quiet and let the enemy listen for something that is no longer there.